The dangerous people are never the loudest ones, Vivian Hale once heard her professor say. At the time, she thought it sounded dramatic. Something people said in classrooms to sound wise. But standing beneath the golden chandeliers of the Beaumont Room 3 years later, balancing a silver tray against one hand, while Manhattan's elite laughed over $1,200 bottles of wine, she realized how terrifyingly true those words really were. The restaurant glowed with warmth against the cold October rain outside. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath soft amber lights. A pianist in the corner played slow jazz while servers moved silently between tables like shadows dressed in black and white. Everything looked perfect, calm, expensive, safe. Vivian knew better. She had learned long ago that danger loved beautiful places. It hid behind tailored suits and polite smiles. It waited quietly while everyone else relaxed. Table 12 requested another Macallan. Her manager whispered while passing her near the kitchen. Vivian nodded automatically. On my way. She lifted the fresh glass from the bar and crossed the marble floor with smooth, practiced movements. Nobody really noticed waitresses unless something went wrong. That was part of the job. Be invisible. Be efficient. Smile softly. Leave quietly. Vivian had become very good at disappearing. But tonight, something felt off. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just wrong in the smallest possible way. Her eyes moved instinctively around the room as she approached table 12. Senator Whitmore laughing too loudly near the fireplace. A couple arguing silently beside the windows. A nervous young banker checking his Rolex every 30 seconds. Tiny details. Human details. Then she saw him. A man sitting alone near the back bar. Mid-40s. Dark coat. Black gloves despite the heated room. Untouched espresso cooling in front of him. Vivian slowed slightly. Most people fidgeted while waiting. Phones. Watches. Napkins. This man moved almost not at all. Stillness like that always meant something. The billionaire at table 12 barely looked up as she set down the whiskey beside him. Julian Mercer, founder of Mercer Dynamics. The kind of man magazines called visionary because billionaire sounded too simple. You're Macallan, sir, Vivian said softly. His attention stayed fixed on the contract open beside his plate. Vivian turned to leave. Then the reflection caught her eye. Not in the mirror. Not in the glass wall behind the table. In the polished silver spoon resting beside Julian's untouched dessert plate. A distorted reflection of the man near the bar. One hand inside his coat. Head tilted slightly toward the pianist. Waiting. Vivian stopped breathing for half a second. Her eyes narrowed. The pianist's song was almost over. The man at the bar checked the large clock above the wine display without moving his head. And suddenly, every tiny detail locked together inside her mind with terrifying clarity. Timing. Positioning. Exit visibility. The untouched coffee. Julian finally looked up, annoyed by her silence. Something wrong? He asked coldly. Vivian stared at the spoon again, then at the reflection behind him. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Sir, Julian frowned. What? Vivian slowly set the tray down beside his table. Don't turn around. Julian Mercer did not scare easily. Men worth billions rarely did. Fear was usually reserved for people with unstable bank accounts and uncertain futures, not for someone who controlled defense contracts, satellite systems, and half the technology reshaping modern security. But something about Vivian's voice unsettled him instantly. It was not panic. Panic could be ignored. Panic was emotional. This was worse. Calm certainty. The kind that made people listen before they understood why. Julian slowly lowered the pen in his hand. Explain, he said quietly. Vivian kept her eyes fixed on the reflection in the spoon. The man near the bar checked every exit when he walked in. She whispered. He ordered espresso 30 minutes ago and never touched it. He keeps watching the pianist instead of the room. Julian frowned slightly. Maybe he likes music. No, her answer came immediately. He is waiting for the music to stop. Somewhere behind them, the piano melody drifted softly through the restaurant. Slow, elegant, beautiful enough to make wealthy strangers feel safe for a few minutes. Vivian hated how effective beautiful places could be at lowering people's instincts. Julian studied her face for the first time since she approached his table. She looked composed, almost detached. No shaking hands. No dramatic expression. Just sharp blue eyes locked onto details everyone else ignored. Who are you? He asked. A waitress, Vivian replied. Tonight, that needs to be enough. Across the room, Laughter erupted near the fireplace as a senator lifted a glass for another toast. Nobody noticed the man near the bar adjust his cuff twice in 10 seconds. Nobody noticed the slight bulge beneath his coat. Nobody except Vivian. Her breathing stayed even. But internally, every instinct she spent years trying to bury had awakened all at once. Patterns, timing, angles. She hated how quickly her mind still worked. "Sir," she said softly. "In about 30 seconds, the song ends." Julian glanced toward the pianist. She was right. The melody was nearing its close. And Vivian finally looked at him directly. "When it does, I need you to get under the table immediately." Julian almost laughed. Almost. But then he noticed something else. Vivian was subtly moving nearby guests away from his section without alarming them. A quiet word here. A polite redirect there. One couple suddenly received complimentary dessert near the opposite wall. Another guest was encouraged to take a phone call near the lobby. She was clearing space without anyone realizing it. Julian felt a strange tightness in his chest. "You planned this?" "No," Vivian answered carefully. "I noticed it." The pianist reached the final chorus. The room softened into near silence as conversations faded beneath the music. Vivian's eyes shifted briefly toward the large windows facing Fifth Avenue. Rain slid down the glass in silver streaks. Outside, headlights blurred through the storm. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected gold across polished marble floors. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Then the man at the bar moved for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. Just a slight turn of his wrist beneath the coat. Vivian's entire body went still. "Now," she whispered. Julian did not ask another question. Something deep inside him trusted her before logic could catch up. He dropped beneath the table just as the piano stopped completely. And in the sudden silence that followed, the entire restaurant heard the sound of shattering glass. The sound echoed through the restaurant like a thunderclap. Crystal shattered across the marble floor as guests screamed and dropped beneath tables. Chairs scraped violently. Expensive glasses tipped over. The golden calm of the Beaumont room disappeared in less than 2 seconds. But Vivian Hale did not panic. She was already moving. "Stay down," she told Julian sharply as another crash exploded somewhere near the front windows. Her voice cut through the chaos with terrifying clarity. Not loud, not emotional, precise. Julian stayed beneath the table, pulse hammering inside his ears. Around him, senators, investors, and executives crawled across the floor in confusion while security guards shouted conflicting orders into radios. None of them seemed to understand where the danger actually was. Vivian did. She grabbed the white tablecloth from a nearby service cart and threw it over the shattered glass beside Julian's table. "Move now," she whispered. Julian followed her without thinking. It disturbed him how naturally he obeyed her. They crouched behind a marble support column near the center of the dining room. Vivian glanced toward the bar again. The man in the dark coat was gone. Her jaw tightened slightly. "That is bad," she murmured. "What the hell is happening?" Julian demanded quietly. Vivian ignored the question. Instead, her eyes scanned the room with cold focus. Exit signs. Kitchen door. Service hallway. Ceiling mirrors. She noticed everything at once. Then she saw it. A waiter pushing a dessert cart toward the lobby far too quickly. Wrong shoes. Wrong posture. Wrong rhythm. Vivian's eyes narrowed instantly. "No," she whispered. Julian followed her gaze. The server looked normal enough. Black uniform. White gloves. Head lowered. But Vivian noticed the tiny details nobody else would ever see. The jacket sleeves were too short by half an inch. The shoes were military. Polished, not restaurant standard. And most importantly, real waiters slowed down during panic because they watch people. This man watched exits. Vivian stepped directly into his path before anyone else realized what she was doing. "Kitchen is closed," she said calmly. The man froze for a fraction of a second. Tiny, almost invisible, but it was enough. Vivian saw his right hand tighten near the cart handle. "Ma'am," he said politely, "please move aside." Southern accent. Forced. Practiced. Julian watched Vivian carefully. She looked completely calm, but something in her posture had changed. Like a person remembering an old version of themselves they tried hard to bury. "You are not staff," Vivian said softly. The man smiled slightly. "Not nervous. Not surprised. You should not have noticed me." Julian felt the air change around them. Heavy. Silent. Dangerous in a way words could not explain. Security guards finally started moving toward the lobby, but too slowly. Vivian knew they still did not understand the real problem. The first distraction had never been the actual objective. It was meant to create confusion. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the service entrance near the kitchen. Empty hallway. Swinging door, still moving slightly. Someone else had passed through seconds earlier. Vivian's stomach dropped. "Julian," she said quietly, never taking her eyes off the fake waiter. "How many people know about your meeting tonight?" Julian frowned. "Very few." "Then somebody close to you sold the information." For the first time in years, Julian Mercer felt something colder than fear. Betrayal. And judging by the look in Vivian Hale's eyes, she had realized who the real target was long before anyone else in the room. The fake waiter smiled like a man who had already calculated every possible outcome. That was what unsettled Vivian most. Not anger. Not panic. Confidence. The kind built from planning. Around them, restaurant guests were still crouched behind tables, while security rushed people toward the exits. Rain hammered against the tall windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and silver. Somewhere near the kitchen, a woman was crying softly. Somewhere else, someone dropped a tray that shattered against the floor. But in the center of all that chaos, the man with the dessert cart remained perfectly still. Vivian hated stillness like that. Julian slowly rose beside her, adjusting the sleeve of his dark suit with controlled movements. He looked calm on the outside, but Vivian noticed the tiny changes immediately. Faster breathing, tighter jaw, eyes moving more than usual. "You think someone inside my company planned this?" he asked quietly. "I think somebody knew exactly where you would be tonight," Vivian answered. "And they expected your security team to focus on the obvious threat first." Julian glanced toward the broken windows near the front of the restaurant. Realization slowly settled across his face. Diversion. The first attack had only created confusion. The real operation started afterward. The fake waiter tilted his head slightly while studying Vivian. "You used to do this professionally," he said. It was not a question. Vivian said nothing. Her silence answered enough. The man's eyes narrowed with something close to respect. "I wondered if they trained you to notice breathing patterns," he continued calmly. "Turns out they did." Julian looked sharply at Vivian. "What is he talking about?" Before she could answer, the man reached into the dessert cart very slowly. Security guards near the lobby immediately raised their weapons, but Vivian lifted one hand without taking her eyes off him. "Do not," she said firmly. Something in her tone stopped everyone instantly. The man pulled out a simple black phone and placed it carefully on top of the cart. The screen displayed a live security feed. Julian's private penthouse lobby, empty except for one person standing near the elevators. Julian's expression darkened immediately. "That is impossible." Vivian stared at the screen. The woman near the elevators wore a gray coat and carried a leather portfolio. Mid-30s. Blonde hair. Calm posture. Vivian felt cold the second she saw her face. "Who is she?" Julian's voice lowered dangerously. Vivian answered before the man could. "Someone you trust." Julian stepped closer to the screen. Then his face changed completely. Not fear. Something worse. Disbelief. "Rachel," he whispered. The fake waiter watched him carefully. "Your chief financial officer is very cooperative." Julian looked physically sick for half a second before forcing control back into his expression. Rachel Bennett had worked beside him for 8 years. 8 years of board meetings, negotiations, private flights, and billion-dollar acquisitions. He trusted her with everything. Vivian noticed the exact moment Julian stopped thinking like a billionaire and started thinking like a betrayed man. It changed the room instantly. "What does she want?" he asked coldly. The fake waiter smiled faintly. "Not money." Vivian's stomach tightened. Money was predictable. Power was predictable. But people who wanted revenge were different. Harder to calculate. The man glanced toward Vivian again. "You really should not have noticed me," he said softly. "Now everything becomes more complicated." Vivian met his gaze without flinching. "No," she replied quietly. Complicated was walking into this restaurant. For the first time all night, the man's smile disappeared completely. Rain rolled down the towering windows of the Beaumont room, while silence spread across the restaurant in heavy waves. Even the guests who had been whispering moments earlier now watched the fake waiter with pale, uncertain faces. Nobody understood what was truly happening anymore. Not completely. but they all sensed something deeper than a random attack unfolding in front of them. Vivian Hale noticed the smallest details first. She always did. The man's breathing had changed after Rachel Bennett appeared on the phone screen. Slower now. More controlled. Like someone approaching the final stage of a carefully planned operation. That meant one thing. He believed he had already won. Vivian hated people who believed that. Julian Mercer stared at the image of Rachel standing inside his penthouse lobby. 8 years of trust collapsed silently behind his eyes. Vivian could almost see it happening. "Turn the sound on," Julian said coldly. The fake waiter studied him for a moment, then tapped the phone screen. Rachel's voice immediately filled the tense restaurant. "The servers will unlock in less than 4 minutes," she said calmly. "Once the transfer completes, Mercer Dynamics loses the defense contract automatically." Julian's expression hardened. Around them, several executives exchanged nervous looks. Mercer Dynamics controlled billions in national security technology. Losing those contracts overnight would destroy entire divisions of the company. Vivian watched Julian carefully. Most powerful men became emotional when betrayed. Angry. Reckless. But Julian did something unexpected. He went completely still. The kind of stillness that meant his mind was working faster than everyone else's. "This was never about hurting me physically," he said quietly. The fake waiter gave a faint nod. "No. Fear creates distraction. Distraction creates access." Vivian glanced back toward the shattered front windows. The first attack had forced security systems offline. Emergency protocols. Communication reroutes. Confusion. All engineered to create a gap. And somewhere across Manhattan, Rachel Bennett was using that gap to empty one of the most secure corporate systems in the country. Vivian suddenly understood the real reason the fake waiter remained calm. He was not there to escape. He was there to delay Julian long enough for the transfer to finish. "How much time?" Vivian asked. Julian checked the expensive silver watch on his wrist automatically. 3 minutes, 40 seconds. Vivian's eyes moved rapidly around the room. Security guards. Panicked guests. Locked elevators. Storm outside. Then her attention shifted toward the pianist's corner near the east wall. Hidden beneath the polished piano bench sat a small black amplifier connected directly into the restaurant's emergency network. Vivian's pulse quickened slightly. "Who controls the building backup systems?" she asked. Julian frowned. "Why?" "Because your company's servers are probably rerouting through emergency power channels after the attack." Julian looked at her sharply. Realization flashed instantly across his face. "The backup line." Vivian nodded once. "If Rachel cannot finish the transfer through the emergency network, the system locks automatically." For the first time since the chaos began, Julian almost smiled. Small. Cold. Impressed. "You figured that out from a restaurant piano?" Vivian finally looked away for the first time all night. "People hide important things in beautiful places," she said quietly. The fake waiter's calm expression cracked slightly. Barely noticeable. But Vivian caught it immediately. He had not expected her to connect the emergency network that quickly. "Interesting," he murmured softly. Vivian stepped toward the piano without hesitation. "Stop her," the man suddenly ordered into a hidden earpiece. Somewhere far above Manhattan, Rachel Bennett probably heard those words at the exact same moment. Julian moved instantly beside Vivian. Not as a billionaire now. Not as a CEO. As someone finally realizing the quiet waitress beside him might be the only reason his entire world had not already collapsed. Vivian crossed the restaurant floor with controlled urgency, while Julian stayed beside her step for step. The fake waiter watched them carefully now, his calm beginning to fracture around the edges. That alone told Vivian everything she needed to know. They were running out of time. The pianist had quietly disappeared during the chaos, leaving only the soft hiss of the speakers and the distant sound of rain against glass. Guests remained huddled near the walls while security tried desperately to restore order, but the real battle was no longer happening inside the restaurant. It was happening somewhere deep inside Mercer Dynamics' encrypted servers. Vivian reached the piano and crouched beside the polished black bench. Her fingers slid underneath the frame until they found the small amplifier hidden beneath it. Just as she suspected. Additional wiring. Too advanced for a restaurant sound system. Julian knelt beside her. "Can you stop it?" Vivian examined the cables quickly. "Maybe." The fake waiter stepped closer. "You are smarter than they told us." Vivian did not look up. People usually say that right before things go badly. Julian glanced toward the phone screen still resting on the dessert cart. Rachel Bennett was moving through his penthouse calmly, typing commands into a tablet connected to his private network. 3 minutes earlier, he would have trusted her with his life. Now he realized she had probably spent years studying every weakness in his empire while smiling across conference tables. The thought unsettled him more than the attack itself. Vivian traced one wire from the amplifier into the wall panel behind the piano. Hidden access line. Emergency power reroute exactly like she predicted. If I disconnect this manually, she said carefully, the backup system will shut down for exactly 90 seconds. Julian understood immediately. Enough time to lock the transfer. Vivian nodded once. Unless Rachel already bypassed the security protocols. The fake waiter smiled faintly again. She did. Julian's jaw tightened. Then why are you still here? For the first time, the man hesitated before answering. Because she was never supposed to do this alone. Vivian slowly looked up from the wiring. That sentence changed everything. The man was not just hired security. Not just a distraction. He was personally invested. She studied his face more carefully now. The controlled breathing. The military posture. The old scar near his left eyebrow, partially hidden beneath the restaurant lighting. Recognition flickered somewhere deep inside her memory. Not the man himself. The training style. The discipline. Federal. Former federal. Vivian felt a chill move down her spine. You worked operations, she said quietly. The man's expression darkened slightly. A long time ago. Julian stared between them. You know him? No, Vivian answered softly. But I know the kind of people who taught him. Silence settled briefly between them while the storm outside intensified. Lightning flashed through the tall windows, turning the restaurant silver for half a second. Then Vivian noticed something else. The fake waiter kept touching the ring on his right hand every time Rachel appeared on the phone screen. Tiny movement. Emotional movement. Not professional. Personal. Vivian's eyes narrowed. This is not about Mercer dynamics, she realized aloud. It is about Rachel. The man said nothing. He did not need to. Julian slowly looked back at the phone screen where Rachel paused near the penthouse windows, staring out across Manhattan with strangely distant eyes. Suddenly, the billion-dollar cyber attack felt less like corporate sabotage and more like something far more dangerous. Grief. Vivian understood that kind of danger better than most people. Because grief did not care about money, or logic, or consequences. And when wounded people stopped fearing consequences, they became impossible to predict. The storm outside Manhattan grew heavier by the minute, turning the windows of the Beaumont room into walls of moving silver. Inside, the air felt tense enough to crack. Vivian remained crouched beside the hidden amplifier beneath the piano while Julian stood close behind her, eyes fixed on the fake waiter across the room. Nobody moved carelessly anymore. Not the security guards. Not the guests. Even fear had become quiet. Vivian slowly disconnected one panel on the amplifier, exposing a second layer of hidden circuitry beneath it. More advanced than she expected. Whoever built this operation knew exactly how Mercer Dynamics handled emergency reroutes. This was planned months ago, she murmured. Julian looked down at her. How can you tell? Vivian pointed toward the modified wiring. These components are custom-made. Somebody spent a long time studying your infrastructure. Julian's face darkened again at the thought of Rachel Bennett having access to every internal system for nearly a decade. Trust suddenly felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. Across the restaurant, the fake waiter finally stepped away from the dessert cart. Slowly, calmly. You still do not understand why she is doing this, he said. Vivian glanced toward the phone screen. Rachel now stood inside Julian's private office at the penthouse, staring at an old framed photograph sitting beside the city windows. Her expression had changed. Not angry anymore. Sad. Vivian noticed those shifts immediately. Sad people made irreversible decisions more easily than angry people. Then explain it, Julian said coldly. The man hesitated for a moment before answering. 3 years ago, Mercer Dynamics launched a satellite defense program in Eastern Europe. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. Project Helios. Vivian immediately noticed the change in the fake waiter's breathing at the mention of the name. Personal. Deeply personal. The system failed during testing. The man continued quietly. A guidance malfunction triggered an evacuation in the wrong sector. Julian's expression remained controlled, But Vivian saw the recognition behind his eyes. He remembered now. Not the headlines. The internal report. Civilian casualties, Julian said softly. 26 people, the man corrected. One of them was Rachel's younger brother. Silence spread through the restaurant again. Even the rain outside seemed distant for a second. Vivian slowly stood up from beside the piano. Suddenly the entire night made horrible sense. Not greed. Not corporate sabotage. Grief mixed with intelligence. The most dangerous combination possible. Julian looked toward Rachel's image on the screen again. She never told me. Because your board buried the report before it reached the public, the man answered sharply. You called it operational containment. Julian said nothing. And that silence told Vivian more than any explanation could. Powerful companies rarely survived by admitting mistakes. They survived by controlling narratives. Vivian watched Julian carefully now. The billionaire who once looked untouchable suddenly seemed exhausted beneath the restaurant lights. Human. I did not know her brother was involved, he admitted quietly. The fake waiter's eyes hardened. That is exactly the problem. Vivian felt tension tightening across the room again. Dangerous tension. Emotional tension. Harder to control than panic. She understood both sides now more than she wanted to. She understood Rachel's grief. But she also understood what happened when grief became obsession. If Rachel destroys Mercer Dynamics tonight, Vivian said carefully, those people do not come back. The fake waiter looked at her for a long moment. No, he admitted softly. But sometimes people just want the world to hurt the way they hurt. Those words hit the room harder than any shattered glass earlier that night. Because everybody understood them. Julian looked down briefly at the silver watch on his wrist. 1 minute, he said quietly. Vivian's eyes returned instantly to the exposed wiring beneath the piano. They were almost out of time. And somewhere high above Manhattan, Rachel Bennett was seconds away from making a decision that could change all of their lives forever. The countdown on Julian Mercer's watch reached 43 seconds. Every person inside the Beaumont room could feel time shrinking around them, even if they did not fully understand why. The storm outside rattled the towering windows while distant sirens echoed through Manhattan below. Vivian stood beside the exposed wiring beneath the piano, her fingers hovering over the emergency network panel while her mind calculated every possible outcome. None of them were clean. Across the room, the fake waiter remained motionless beside the dessert cart, but his eyes had changed. Less controlled now. Less certain. Vivian recognized that look immediately. Emotional operations always became unstable near the end. Julian stared at Rachel Bennett's image on the phone screen. She still stood inside his penthouse office, city lights glowing behind her like fractured stars. In her hand was the same leather portfolio she carried to every board meeting for the past 8 years. Vivian wondered how many times Rachel had stood beside Julian while secretly carrying all that grief alone. 28 seconds, Julian said quietly. Vivian inhaled slowly. Then she looked directly at the fake waiter. What is her brother's name? The question caught him off guard. His expression tightened slightly. Daniel. Vivian nodded once. How old was he? 23. Julian looked sharply toward Vivian, confused by what she was doing. But she ignored him. Her eyes stayed locked on the man beside the dessert cart. Did Rachel ever tell you what Daniel was like? She asked softly. The fake waiter hesitated again. Why does that matter? Because revenge changes people, Vivian answered. And sometimes they forget who they started fighting for. Silence spread through the restaurant. Even the security guards stopped moving. The fake waiter's jaw tightened. Vivian continued carefully. If Daniel mattered that much to her, would he want this? The man looked away for the first time all night. Tiny movement. Tiny crack. But Vivian saw it immediately. She stepped closer slowly, voice calm and steady. Destroying Mercer Dynamics will not bring him back. No, the man said quietly. But it will finally make them pay attention. Julian lowered his eyes briefly. Those words hit harder than accusation. Because deep down, he knew there was truth inside them. Billion-dollar companies rarely listened until consequences became impossible to ignore. Vivian noticed the guilt settling across Julian's face beneath the restaurant lights. Real guilt. Not public relations guilt. Human guilt. How many reports did your board bury after Helios? She asked softly without looking at him. Julian stayed silent for 2 full seconds. Too many, he admitted. The fake waiter looked stunned by the answer. He clearly expected denial. Excuses. Corporate language. Not honesty. Vivian felt the atmosphere shift instantly. Honesty changed rooms. Even dangerous rooms. On the phone screen, Rachel suddenly stopped typing. Slowly, she lifted her head toward the penthouse security camera, as if hearing the conversation somehow. Rain streaked across the massive windows behind her. She looked exhausted, not triumphant. Vivian stepped toward the phone. "Rachel," she said quietly, "if you destroy everything tonight, your brother becomes another tragedy people argue about online for 2 days before forgetting again." Rachel's eyes filled with emotion for the first time. "Then what am I supposed to do?" she whispered through the speaker. Vivian glanced briefly toward Julian before answering. "Make them finally tell the truth." The room went completely still. Julian Mercer closed his eyes for half a second, like a man realizing the cost of silence all at once. Then he looked directly at the phone screen. "Unlock the servers," he said quietly. Rachel stared at him in disbelief. Julian's voice remained calm. "Tomorrow morning, I will release the entire Helios report publicly. Every document, every internal decision. No lawyers, no containment." The fake waiter turned sharply toward Julian. "You would destroy your own company?" Julian looked at the shattered restaurant around him, then at Vivian Hale standing quietly beside the piano. "No," he said softly. "I think I finally realized what was destroying it already." For a moment, nobody inside the Beaumont room moved at all. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows overlooking Manhattan, while the soft hum of emergency lights reflected across shattered crystal and overturned chairs. The storm outside sounded distant now, smaller somehow, because the real storm had already happened inside the room. Rachel Bennett stared at Julian Mercer through the phone screen, emotion trembling silently across her face. 8 years of anger. 8 years of grief. 8 years waiting for someone powerful enough to finally admit the truth. And now, somehow, it was happening because of a waitress nobody had noticed 3 hours earlier. Vivian Hale slowly stepped back from the piano, giving the silence room to breathe. She understood something most people never did. Some moments changed lives not because people shouted, but because someone finally stopped pretending. The fake waiter lowered his eyes briefly. For the first time all night, he looked tired instead of dangerous. "If you release those files," he said quietly to Julian, "your board will turn on you." Julian gave a faint smile without humor. Maybe they should have done that years ago. The man looked toward Vivian then, studying her with quiet disbelief. "You really changed everything tonight." Vivian shook her head gently. No, her voice remained soft. "The truth did." Across the restaurant, security teams finally began escorting guests safely toward the exits while police lights flashed blue and red against the rain outside. But nobody rushed anymore. The fear had changed shape. It no longer felt like panic. It felt like reflection. Julian stepped closer to the phone screen. "Rachel," he said carefully, "unlock the servers." She held his gaze for several long seconds. Then slowly, almost painfully, she typed one final command into her tablet. A soft tone echoed from Julian's watch. "Transfer canceled. Emergency lock restored." Somewhere deep beneath Manhattan, Mercer Dynamics servers sealed themselves shut again. The fake waiter closed his eyes briefly in relief. Not because the mission failed, because it finally ended. Rachel looked exhausted as tears quietly slid down her face. "He was 23, she whispered. "He wanted to be an engineer." Julian lowered his eyes. "I know." And for the first time since Vivian met him, he sounded less like a billionaire and more like a man carrying something heavy. The call disconnected moments later. Silence settled across the restaurant one final time. Then Vivian quietly removed her apron strings and folded the black fabric neatly over the piano bench. Julian watched her carefully. "You are leaving?" Vivian nodded. "My shift is over." Despite everything that happened, that answer almost made him laugh. "Almost." "Vivian," he said softly. She paused near the shattered windows where cold rain light spilled across the marble floor. "How did you notice all of it?" Vivian looked outside at the blurred city glowing through the storm. Yellow taxis, wet streets, thousands of strangers moving through the night without seeing each other at all. "Because powerful people are trained to look for threats," she answered quietly. "But lonely people notice behavior." Julian stood completely still after that. The fake waiter said nothing. Even the officers nearby seemed quieter somehow. Vivian slipped on her coat and walked toward the restaurant exit without waiting for praise, attention, or reward. Just before she reached the door, Julian called after her one last time. What happens tomorrow? Vivian glanced back over her shoulder, soft amber light catching briefly in her eyes. Tomorrow, she said calmly. People finally listen. Then she stepped into the rain and disappeared into the Manhattan night, while behind her, inside a restaurant filled with wealthy strangers and shattered glass, an entire room of powerful people sat silently confronting the one thing they had ignored for years. The truth.